Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first in the series of lectures for 2021-22. We haven't had any since February 2019. As you know, COVID-19 interrupted the series. Tonight, above the door where we just came in, is the Stornoway coat of arms, and on it you'll see three herring. And tonight, Ken Galloway is going to talk about why it appears on the coat of arms. Stornoway's herring industry. I give you a Ken.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to open the Society's winter series of lectures. Looking at my first 4 slides, you're probably wondering if I brought the wrong presentation. No, I have not. I decided to use some images of folk music from the 60s and 70s to demonstrate the huge impact which tonight's topic has had on people in all communities. The 4 folk groups shown were the Spinners, the Clancy Brothers, the Dubliners, and this is the Corries. And the common factor among them is herring. In fact, many herring, the shoals of herring. A song composed in 1962 by Ewan MacColl, a singer-songwriter born of Scottish parents and resident at that time in Manchester. Now, when I was a student in Aberdeen 54 years ago, we used to regularly belt out this song to the accompaniment of a guitar played by a guy who later became a distinguished political journalist. And although I can't see too well in the dark, there may be a member of my group of rather dodgy student folk singers here tonight. This is the Humble Herring. And here is a verse from that song. I'm not going to sing it, I'm just going to recite it. Oh, the work was hard and the hours were long, and the treatment, sure, it took some bearing. And I used to sleep standing on my feet, and I dream about the shoals of herring. Stornoway's herring industry was huge. The common factors in the majority of the images which I'll show you tonight are hustle and bustle, speed, hard work and difficult conditions, and the impact which this industry had on Lewis in general and on Stornoway in particular. It may therefore appear a bit strange that I should begin in a quiet location in Stornoway's inner harbour, known to us as Lazy Corner. But if you look very closely near the bow of the boat berthed right at the corner, you'll see the number 486. SY 486 was the Murnock. She was launched in May 1903 for Alexander MacLeod of Knock Point, length 82 feet, keel 61 feet, beam 21 feet, and depth 12 feet. The Murnock was among the last of the Zulus built by Mackintosh of Portessie, a company which had been building fishing boats since around 1830. Although Mackintosh started building steam drifters around 1900, in 1903 they were still building mainly Zulus, with the Murnock being one of 6 launched in that year. Construction of a Zulu took about 8 weeks, and the costs were around £500. Sandy MacLeod fished the Murnock continuously up to the outbreak of World War II, refusing to convert her to engine power and thus becoming one of the last links to the past, being the last British herring drifter to fish under sail power. Now this photo shows Stornoway fishermen sorting their nets on number 2 pier. It was taken in the early 1930s and used for a 1932 postcard. Carn House, which was demolished in 1954, can be seen to the left of the town hall. The drift nets got their name from the manner in which they were worked. The nets were cast or shot into the sea, where they hung perpendicularly from floats on the surface of the sea, forming, as it were, a perforated wall. When the shoals tried to pass through the perforations or meshes, they were caught because the meshes were only large enough to permit the head and the gills of the fish to enter, but too small to allow the thicker part of the body of the fish to pass through. In the days before fishing boats were equipped with sonar equipment to enable them to locate the herring shoals, the fishermen relied on various signs which they took to indicate the whereabouts of the herring, such as an oily surface on the water, the presence of whales or an abnormal number of solan geese and other seabirds. Some fishermen claimed they could smell the herring, and an experienced eye could judge from the colour of the sea if there were herring likely to be about, because herring feed on plankton, minute animal and vegetable organisms suspended in the sea. If this was present in large quantities, it tended to turn the sea a light brown colour. A large shoal of herring could also be seen with the naked eye if it was near the surface. The sea turned a reddish colour. When the nets were set, they were not fixed to anything, and neither were they towed, but left free to drift, as the name suggests. Stornoway was created a borough of barony in 1607 and became a police borough in 1863. The arms were granted on January the 14th, 1958. The arms were based on the borough seal from 1892. And as you can see here, there is only one industry represented, that is the fishing industry, with a ship and the fish symbolising that industry. The castle is the old castle of Stornoway. The motto comes from the armorial achievement for the incorporated trades of Stornoway, which was registered in 1772, and these incorporated trades are represented high on the walls of this hall. By the 1850s, Stornoway was fast becoming a town of some commercial importance, based on its reputation as having the best harbour in the vicinity of Scotland's northwest coast. It also had a shipbuilding and repair facility, and its harbour catered for the lucrative shipping trade in the Atlantic waters. But it was to be the humble herring that would establish Stornoway as a centre for the industry. By 1876, the demand for fishing stations in Stornoway Harbour was so great that they were let out to the highest bidders. In 1868, a major Scottish bank built a handsome structure on North Beach Street to act as its Stornoway office. That building is still there, it's the Royal Bank. And two other banking interests soon followed suit, an indication that Stornoway's commercial base was bordering on being financially significant. And before long, the town was recognised as the major herring port of Britain, if not of Europe. And the image we see here is from the James Matheson era, and it shows Caddy Point in the foreground, with its original castellated boathouse on the side. The grass and landscaped base of Caddy Point with a flagpole. You can see Goat Island without the slipway, and note the huge fleet of Zulu fishing vessels in the distance in the outer harbour. Here we see more evidence of a busy Stornoway harbour. In the early years of the industry, the main market for Scottish herring was in the West Indies, where fish were in great demand as a cheap food for slaves in the plantations, and the quality of the cure was not very important. When slavery was abolished by the Acts of 1807 and 1833, the bottom fell out of the West Indies market. Steady progress was made in Europe from the early 19th century, and the discovery of a process called the Scottish cure was one of the main factors which resulted in the Scottish herring industry capturing a large share of the European market. The fleet normally lay in harbour during the day, departing for the fishing grounds in the evening, shooting the nets approximately at sunset and hauling them at sunrise, thus enabling the herring to be delivered to the quayside in the morning within a few hours of being caught. The sea around Scotland was a gold mine, with the largest fishery the world had ever seen. In the summer months, at the height of the herring fishing season, Stornoway's population tripled, from its usual figure of around 3,000 to nearly 9,000 people. The extra ones made up of fishermen, herring gutters, packers, fish curers, coopers, carters, and labourers. In 1899, a reporter stated that there were, on one Sunday morning, no fewer than 930 fishing boats in the harbour. During each week, these boats landed their herring catches to be handled by gutters, who cleaned the fish and then packed them, lightly salted in barrels. Special cargo boats were chartered to take some of these barrels to places as distant as Germany, Russia, and the countries in the proximity of the Baltic Sea. The fishing vessels round the harbour seen here are Zulus and are identifiable by their tall masts. Now, this is Stornoway Inner Harbour, North Beach, round Lazy Corner, and on to Cromwell Street Quay, absolutely packed with steam drifters, clearly identifiable by their tall funnels. The first steam drifter was built in Leith in 1880. Interest was initially slow, but by 1882 there were 7. The main building phase for the steam drifter was from 1900 to 1914, and by 1914 there were 981 registered steam drifters in Scotland. The last Scottish steam drifter was built by Alexander Hall of Aberdeen in 1932. These vessels continued to make a huge contribution to the industry, which by World War II was in serious decline. By 1954, it was thought there were only 6 steam drifters left in existence. They travelled at about 9 to 11 knots, and you can see a steam drifter on the left here. The first steam drifters were made of wood, but steel hulls were soon introduced. They were well designed for the crew, with a main structure containing the wheelhouse and the deckhouse. They did not have sails, apart from one mizzen sail, which was used to keep the boat steady at the fishing location. The main function of the mast was as a crane for lifting the catch ashore. They also had a steam capstan on the foredeck near the mast for hauling nets. The steam drifters had thin, high funnels so that the steam was released high above the deck, away from the fishermen. They were nicknamed woodbines because the tall funnels looked like the popular brand of cigarettes. These boats had a crew of about 12, made up of a skipper, driver, fireman to look after the boiler, and up to 9 deckhands. The old fish mart in Stornoway opened for business in 1894, and the architect was the civil engineer Alexander MacDonald, and the structure was erected by the old Stornoway firm of Ross and Mackenzie at a cost of £1,200. During the planning process, an objection was raised by Lady Matheson, who believed the new building would interfere with her view from the Lewis Castle across the harbour, and the site was shifted a little to the north, a move which involved further negotiations with the occupant of Tolmie Store, Alex Mackenzie steamboat agent, and Messrs J.M. Morrison and John Mackenzie fish curers. The upper floor of the fish mart was designed to accommodate 250 people, and the mart had a total of 14 offices. It was proposed that 8 offices be set aside for use by fish salesmen, and that the remaining offices be let by auction. The proposal that a small office be used by telegraph boys at an annual rent of £2 was blocked by the General Post Office on the grounds that the services of these telegraph boys would only be permitted if the use of the office was granted free of charge. And here we see another view of the fish mart from a different angle. If you look closely at the young boy, second from the left, with the white neck gear, you can see the leather pouches on his belt, indicating that he was a telegraph boy. After a long series of debates and arguments, the old fish mart was finally demolished, with the new ferry terminal opened in 1997, having a design to reflect the octagonal shape of the old building. The Stornoway kippering industry was an important element of the town's economy. Almost daily, cargo boats sailed away from the harbour with hundreds of boxes of kippers, the quality of which earned the product a status and distinction which was recognised the world over. Boats sailed for Liverpool, while other boxes were taken to Caerphilly to be transported by rail to the markets at Billingsgate in London. Now we have a look at the land-based herring industry activity. Basketfuls of herring were taken from the boats, and when there was a fair number of these ready and poured into large wooden troughs known as farlans. A farlan could take many crans of herring, depending on its size, and the gutting girls positioned themselves along both sides of the farlan after the herring was lightly sprinkled with rough salt, which enabled the gutters to grasp the otherwise slippery herring. Speed and fast handling were essential. The gutting was done in a remarkably quick movement. They grabbed a herring, and in a fast movement, with a special, very sharp knife called a kutak, the gut was removed with a quick turn of the hand. Without so much as a glance, the fish were flung into one of 3 containers placed behind the gutter as a preliminary selection of the herring into 3 grades: large, medium, or small, or as the trade referred to them at the time, mateys full, mateys, and mateys small. The small containers or baskets were taken from the gutters and plunged into a large trough, and again lightly sprinkled with rough salt, ready for the packer to set to work. This is a scene on Cromwell Street Quay, close to the present location of Scott's seafood shop. And in addition to the scale of the local employment, from the 1840s onwards, huge numbers of our Stornoway and Lewis girls travelled across the Minch to work as herring gutters. They followed the herring as the herring moved round the north of Scotland, south from Shetland, to the east coast of Scotland, and finally to East Anglia towards the end of the year. It was in the early 1900s that the movement of the herring girls reached its height. In 1913, there were 3,500 fisher girls from the Western Isles at the East Anglia winter herring season. And as late as 1936, there were still about 1,000 Western Isles girls leaving Stornoway to work at the fishing. To reach the herring ports, the girls had to travel across the Minch, either to Kyle or, on occasions, sailing to Scrabster, and from there to parts of Shetland and down the east coast. Considering the large numbers involved and the fact that they were of necessity travelling third class or steerage, the conditions under which they had to travel were anything but pleasant. The large numbers travelling gained the attention of the Highland News in July 1901, when it was reported that the human tide has been flowing strongly eastward, the mail steamer taking away hundreds of women nightly en route to the east coast fishing. In early September, the route was reversed, and the mail boat nightly was bringing back large crowds of women. A month later, between 150 and 200 girls left the island again, this time bound for Great Yarmouth. In 1904, conditions were so bad that 150 of our girls refused to sail, and the matter was raised at Westminster. The MP for Ross and Cromarty, in complaining about the miserable and insufficient accommodation on the mail steamer, pointed out that during the fishing season he had personally seen the mail steamer overcrowded with fishermen and girls to an extent as to be positively dangerous in rough weather, and they had occasionally to be packed like herrings in a barrel. In 1906, the Highland News announced in September that the mail steamer, the Sheila, was unable to convey the whole of the passengers, and the steamer Gale made a special run with about 150. Only a month later, about 1,000 left to go south. Each night for a week, 100 to 220 girls left, with 500 travelling in one night when the mail steamer had to be assisted by the clansman. Now, this is a scene on North Beach Quay, with the building now housing the Royal Bank, the one we referred to earlier as the first bank in Stornoway, and far left, the one which now accommodates events, previously the Clachan and Max Imperial. In September 1913, a critic of the conditions wrote, "The steerage accommodation is an absolute disgrace. Just fancy a company issuing 200 third-class and steerage tickets some nights when the steerage in question can barely accommodate a dozen people, with a majority of the passengers having to sleep on the deck or go with the cattle. The conditions are abominable and cry for drastic and immediate intervention." Early in 1914, all the 2,500 female workers addressed a memo to the Prime Minister, setting out their grievances and hardships encountered on the steamer service to the mainland, and stating they will refuse to cross the Minch to any of these fishings until a more commodious boat was put on the Stornoway route. At Westminster, the President of the Board of Trade was asked if he would inquire into the allegations made by the girls employed by herring curers as to the conditions under which they were conveyed to and from their work in steamboats. The reply was that inquiries were being made. In 1938, a solution appeared to be in sight. A new vessel was to be commissioned with improved accommodation, including sleeping facilities for third-class passengers. But the irony of it all was that after almost 100 years of crossing the Minch under dreadful conditions, changes in tastes and markets meant that herring fishing was in serious decline by the end of the 1930s. When the opportunity to travel in comparative luxury seemed to be in sight, Stornoway herring girls no longer needed to cross the Minch. After the end of the First World War, the number of fisher girls travelling across the Minch had dropped, but they still had to endure the conditions on board the Sheila and the other ships employed in the mail service. Members of the Stornoway Town Council were only too aware of the situation, and they held what was called an indignation meeting. Ex-Provost Mackenzie described how he had personally crossed the Minch with the girls, and as the steamer was passing Rona Lighthouse, he went forward to see how they were getting on. And he said, "One poor creature, what, between fatigue, cold, and exposure, had become temporarily insane. She got hold of him by the arm and would not let him go, and he had to sit with her all the way until the boat rounded the lighthouse at Stornoway. The resolution for a new and better boat was sent to various members of Parliament, but the response included the comment, 'It is, of course, impossible to guarantee that a small steamer is not at times rather crowded when the traffic is subject to great variations.' But despite all these hardships, our herring girls could still raise a smile, as shown in this well-known photo of North Beach, which has several interesting features of Stornoway visible. In the background is the sail loft, known in its early days as the fishermen's recreation rooms. And closer to the front, we can see the Esso fuel pumps of Kenneth MacLennan, later renamed as Kenneth MacLennan Oils Limited, when it was managed by his son with the same name and the same nickname, Kenny Lemons. If you look closely at the tank just above the third herring girl from the left, you can just see the words Royal Daylight. That was the brand name of the Esso Company's paraffin, with K. MacLennan being the island's main distributor of the product. A few years ago, the Unlauntner Arts Centre staged a Herring Girls exhibition and used the same popular image on commemorative tea towels which were on sale at the event. And here we see some more smiling faces, this time from the early 1950s. And this time I am able to name them. In the front, from the left, Dolina Mackay from Upper Babel, and Mrs. Bremner from Fraserburgh, Shonach Finlay from Calbost and Manor Park, and then at the back, from the left, Magdalene McCaskill of Cheshire and Marybank, Annie Mackenzie, Back and Manor Park, and Mary MacLeod of Coolagreen. Annie Mackenzie's son later became Stornoway Harbour Master in 1978. And my thanks to my society colleague, Cathy Mackay, who provided this information in her book, It Must Be Stornoway. This photo could be given many captions, but I really fancy this one, getting down to it. The photo demonstrates the back-breaking effort involved in the early stages of herring packing, with rough salt being placed in the bottom of the barrel and then having to be rubbed round the base and the lower walls. The packer then set to work, seizing a handful of herring and arranging them in tiers in a rosette fashion, with the bellies of the herring uppermost and their heads towards the outside of the barrel. A sprinkling of rough salt was applied to each layer under the eagle eye of a very competent and experienced cooper. A barrel of herring was said to contain about 700 on average, and the whole job of gutting, dowsing and packing took about 10 minutes on average. The crew of 3 girls gutted and packed approximately 30 barrels in a day of 10 hours, which works out at 1 fish every 10 seconds of the working day. It was the cooper's first job each morning to examine each barrel packed on the previous day to ensure that no pickle had leaked away. And if so, the fish had to be repacked in order they were loaded onto lorries. In the early days, it was horse-drawn trailers that were used. And the herring was conveyed to the curer's curing yard. And the salt melted. The barrels were opened and once again filled to the top. They were then fitted with a tighter lid and left for 10 days or so. Then the pickle was run out through the bunghole, and the barrel was again opened up so it could be topped up with more herring. Then the lid was refitted, and sufficient pickle was poured back in through the bunghole to fill the barrel. The barrels had then July maturing for 15 days before they could be branded with the official brand ready for export. Great care was exercised in the curing of salt herring in Britain, and it was in that way that the British cured herring, done in accordance with the Scotch cure, captured the European continental market for cured herring and retained it until the First and Second World Wars destroyed the trade on which a large number of men and women in the islands depended for their living. It did not prove too difficult for me to find details of where some of our herring was bound for. I found references to national and international markets, but there was an interesting one in Slater's Directory of 1882, which stated that over 70,000 barrels of herring had been sent in 1 year from Stornoway to the markets in Hamburg in Germany, Stettin in Poland, and St. Petersburg in Russia. Steamers carried the barrels to the ports, which had railway stations at the time. That is, Oban and Strom Ferry. Regulations governing the supply and cost of salt in the early 19th century hampered the expansion of the industry, with a tonne of salt in Glasgow costing £44 10 shillings, mainly due to the penal levels of taxation. In 1825, salt duties were abolished, and the price of salt fell in the next decade to £32 per tonne, and then to £1 per tonne, and to 12 shillings, or in our money, 60p per tonne by 1880. But there were also many other factors which assisted the expansion of the industry. The bounty system of subsidies was abandoned in 1830, thereby freeing the small fisherman from restrictions and harassing regulations. In his book entitled Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher and political economist, argued that some fishermen were more interested in catching the subsidy than catching the fish, and from the beginning of the 19th century greatly improved harbour facilities in the north of Scotland, including Stornoway, and the use of machine-made nets from about 1850 improved the catching power of the fleet, which in turn, without these misguided lures of subsidies, enabled fishermen to acquire bigger and better boats. Taken together, the effect of all these factors was significant, enabling an ambitious industry to reap the benefits of the rich fishing grounds on its doorstep. The fleet expanded rapidly, with huge quantities of fresh herring being delivered, ready for gutting and curing, and ready to satisfy the great demand for the Scottish cure in the European market. The Crown brand stencilled on each barrel by the fishery officers came to be recognised all over Europe as the official badge of quality. Now, I just want to pause from the subject of herring to take a very short tour around this impressive photo of Stornoway in 1878. Here we see the Royal Hotel before its extension, which was built later in 1927. Here we see the back of the sail loft, which was built around 1800. The very distinctive front of Lodge Fortrose on Kenneth Street, 1767. And a very interesting piece here, the corner of Church Street without Cobden House, which wasn't built until 1886. The back of this building here is the back of the Louis Hotel, which was built as a private residence in 1829. Amity House, the headquarters of the Stornoway Port Authority now, was built around 1830. And over on the very far right of the photo, we can see the Free Church, which was built in 1845, subsequently seriously damaged by fire in 1850, and then reconstructed in 1854. And that is actually a crop of a much larger photograph of Stornoway from that era. Several years ago, Stornoway Historical Society received a donation of a large collection of annual handbooks which provide very interesting data on the herring industry. These included Scottish fishery tables from 1922, Fishery Board for Scotland reports from 1917, herring trade reports from 1925, and various editions of the Olson's Fisherman's Nautical Almanac, a wonderful collection. And you'll be pleased to hear I will not be covering all of them tonight. However, a very short selected dip into the data will enable you to appreciate how huge the impact was made by the humble herring on our island. And I've chosen 2 years only, 1927 and 1942. And here we see the figures for these 2 years. 1927 was a boom year for herring catches. And according to the Angus MacLeod archive, an estimate of 30 million herring were caught in that year in the vicinity of the mouth of Loch Erisort alone. But you may ask why I am emphasising 1927 as a boom year when you can already see a larger total beside 1942. The answer will now be revealed. But first, let us look at these values in today's prices. Although the figures are increasing substantially from 1927 to 1942, it is important to remember that there are further variables which affect the strength of the economy of the industry. The increase becomes even more striking when the figures, as they are there, are projected to the present day's prices at 2021. In 1927, the value of the catch at today's prices was nearly 20 million, and more than 21 million in 1942. However, these money figures on their own mask the true situation of an industry in ongoing decline by 1942. In 1927, you can see that the herring catch amounted to 38,765 tonnes, with an average sale price of a 100-weight basket being only 41 pence. By 1942, the herring catch had fallen to 15,024 tonnes, with the average sale price of 100-weight basket having risen to 137 pence. So what appears to be a 7% increase in the value of the catch from 1927 to 1942 is masked by a 61% reduction in tonnage actually caught. The data for the period 1913 to 1945, far too extensive to be displayed tonight, confirms that prices of herring in the 1920s and the 1930s were seriously depressed. Conversely, the war years of 1914-18 and 1939-45, when there was less herring fishing activity and the country was desperate for food, the price of a 100-weight basket of herring was consistently above £1, as we can see in the 1942 example shown here. We return now to Lazy Corner, to a much more sombre scene than was shown in the photo of the same location earlier tonight. This 1950s photo shows several fishing boats awaiting decommissioning. We all know that industries are characterised by peaks and troughs. The peaks of the herring industry, as shown tonight, were high, but the trough and the decline of the industry was as spectacularly deep as it was wide. In fact, it could be said that the trough had an open end. Devastating blows were dealt by World War I and by the Isle Air disaster. As the days of peace dawned, many boats, having lain idle, had become unusable. Germany, one of our markets, was economically stricken. The Russian market collapsed. Illegal trawling by boats from ports as far away as Fleetwood was rife. By 1938, there were 111 steam drifters at Stornoway, but only 5 were local. East Coast boats were taking a fifth of the total tonnage of all species caught. After World War II, fishing continued from Stornoway, but the traditions of the herring girl began to recede with the advent of mechanisation. Eating habits changed and herring was less sought after. On the Minch, mainland-based ports such as Malig became more competitive than Stornoway, With the ongoing decline in the numbers of herring caught, systems for catching them changed from drifters to ring netters to trawlers, and then in the 1960s to purse seine or purse net. This, combined with sonar detection of shoals, left the humble herring with little chance of escape. This photo shows steam drifters at North Beach Quay. The almanac lists only 8 steam drifters in Stornoway in 1957. The Windfall, the Hero, the Lewis, the Coronata, the Handsome, the Invernairn, Le Rig, and the Alphin. The open trough, which I referred to earlier, eventually resulted in closure of the herring industry as a defined economic entity in the 1970s. The Lewis Association fishing report had been published in 1947, stating that some confidence still existed among local fishermen. Although the fleet was much smaller, some boats were expensively refitted and reconditioned, and this resulted in the general character of the smaller local fleet being significantly improved. There had been a big effort to maintain and improve standards after World War II. Grant and loan schemes created new opportunities with the birth of the MFVs, motor fishing vessels. They were initially built in 4 classes: 45-footers, 61-footers, 75-footers, and 90-footers. 2 75-foot vessels came to Lewis in 1947, SY-704, the Mornock II of Knock Point, and SY-719, the Sandy Bay from North Tulsta. A veteran fisherman from Sandwick, who had skippered several steam drifters, decided, along with his son, to acquire a new boat, and in 1950, the new Ivy Rose, length 58 feet, built by Jones of Bucky, came to Stornoway, and her name was spawned from a combination of 2 earlier steam drifters, the Girl Ivy and the Rose. By the late 1950s, the main emphasis of the Stornoway fishing fleet was no longer on drift net fishing. Most of the boats moved between drift nets, whitefish, line fishing. 1 or 2 boats tried seine nets and ring netting. And at that time, prawn fishing in Stornoway was still something new and did not catch on really until the 1960s. Prawns used to be dumped overboard because there was no market for them, and the local fishermen maintained that the rocky nature of the seabed in the Minch was not very suitable for seine net fishing, as they suffered a lot of damage to their nets and light trawls, until they became more familiar with the nature of the seabed and were able to chart and avoid certain areas. Herring prices were low in the 1950s, and the market, other than for fish meal, was very restricted. The home market only consumed about 35% of the annual catch. Crews were in danger of falling into serious debt, and by the mid to late 1950s, 1 boat after another was forced to abandon the struggle, until, according to the list of Lewis and Harris fishing boats in the Almanac, the fleet was down from over 50 boats in 1957 to 6 boats in Lewis in 1960, as follows: the Renown, SY-14, the Pansy, SY-29, the Isabella, SY-142, the Seafarer, SY-210, the Golden Sheaf, SY-229, and the Ivy Rose, SY-347. And you'll notice that I have been featuring some of these vessels in individual slides. The Glasgow Herald in June 1959 confirmed that there were only 6 full-time crews in Lewis and 5 in Harris. Contrast this with the number of boats registered in our islands 80 years ago. As you can see from this slide, the figures were absolutely massive. Now, looking at the wider context of fishing for all species, not just herring, it was clear in the 1970s that coastal nations were going to benefit from the discovery of oil. Sociologically and economically, the survival of most of our Scottish Highland and Island communities was dependent to a very large extent on protection for their inshore fishing industry, and the Outer Hebrides was no exception. By 1970, Britain was well down in the league of major fishing nations of the world, with landings only contributing less than 0.2% of GDP. Nevertheless, fishing was of particular importance to Scotland, and the common market countries recognised that their original fisheries policy was appropriate for Scotland. The British Conservative government of Mr. Edward Heath did not attach sufficient importance to our fishing industry to include it in the list of things they considered necessary to negotiate and secure agreement on before entering the common market on 1st January 1973. But early in 1974, a Labour government was returned in the general election, and they held a referendum in 1975 on the terms of entry to the common market, without any long-term protection for the Scottish fishing industry. Britain as a whole voted by a majority to remain in the common market, but the Western Isles and Shetland voted against. We have now gone full circle with Brexit, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now let's have a look at a brighter note. Despite the continuing decline of the herring industry, Stornoway continued to celebrate and to remember the positive side. This photo was taken in August 1956. You can see the evidence of the substantially reduced herring industry activity compared with the busy photos of South Beach shown earlier. Only a few barrels here. You can also see the huge crowds of people packed into South Beach on the right side of the photo. And on the far side of number 1 pier, a ship with a dark hull and a light-coloured funnel is berthed. This is the Royal Yacht Britannia, which brought Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and her family on the royal visit in August 1956. During the visit, the Queen had numerous engagements, and despite the fact that the herring industry was in decline, it was deemed appropriate by the Town Council that the industry should be included in the schedule. Here we see Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth being shown the process of herring packing, accompanied by Stornoway Harbour Commission Chairman Norman McKeever, and the uniformed Royal Navy officer in the centre is Admiral Edmund Rupert Drummond, who was a keen angler and at the time tenant of Garnahein Estate. The left one of the 2 herring girls is Mrs. Ina Leach. This is the Queen's paper knife, which was Stornoway's gift to Her Majesty, a golden kuttak, the knife used by women for gutting herring, honouring the skill of all the island women who had contributed so much to the herring industry. It bears the inscription, presented by the Town Council of Stornoway to Her Most Gracious Majesty to commemorate her visit with His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, 18th August 1956. The blade of the paper knife is made of gold. The handle is of Scottish oak. The inscription is on a gold band along one side of the handle. And along the other side, which we can't see, there is a similar gold band with the town's crest and the motto, God's providence is our inheritance. On the gold blade of the paper knife are the words, replica of a Lewis kuttak. The bronze sculptures of the herring girls located on North Beach and South Beach Quays are the work of Charles S. Engebretsen and Ginny Hutchinson, who are graduates of Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen They used an innovative casting technique to create life-size figures, successfully depicting the poses and actions of two herring girls. The casting was done by specialist fine art foundryman Farquhar Lane of Black Isle Bronze Limited in Nairn, a company born from a much smaller enterprise located in his father's garage in the Black Isle. Here is Ginny Hutchinson at work, assisted by Emma Turnbull, a Scottish artist who modelled for one of the figures. The model was first dressed in the traditional clothing, true to the style of the herring girls. This included handmade wool and tweed clothing and the recreation of the oilskin aprons. When the clothing had been completed, the models reenacted poses involved in gutting and packing until suitable images were arrived at. Then, with clay modelling and plaster casting, original sculptures were created, which were then rendered in wax before being cast in bronze. For the herring barrels, a barrel in the original style was made by a cooper in Aberdeen. Working from photographs and old documentation, the fishwife's basket was made by a Welsh-based craftsman. The baskets, like the barrels, were once extremely common, but now few remain. And these impressive statues were installed by the Stornoway Amenity Trust in 2003-2004 in memory of a lifestyle gone, but not forgotten. In closing this lecture, I return to the humble herring and the words of the singer-songwriter Ewan MacColl. Oh, I earned my keep and I paid my way, and I earned the gear that I was wearing. Sailed 1,000,000 miles, caught 10 million fishes. We were sailing after shoals of herring. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of a tour of more than 200 years of our town and island's industrial history. For me, it has been a fascinating subject to research, made much easier by the wealth of documents and images which are available. And I thank you for supporting Stornoway Historical Society.